Oh, hi. Today I want to know, what time is it? I'm CrossJoel and welcome to A Wonderful Waste of Time, and before you say adventure time, hammer time, or maybe even clobbering time, in this episode we'll be talking about the different meanings of time and the complications in how we measure them. To start, there are two different types of time to be considered. The two forms to consider are the mathematical/scientific measurement of time in seconds, minutes, hours, days and so on, and the grander, more philosophical concept of time as a constant process that's happening whether you're measuring it or not, you insignificant son of a bitch. While it's easier to think of time in the measurements we gave it, which are often based on strong and relative principles like the Earth's rotation, if you were to exist in a world without those ideas, or in a different part of the universe where those rules were different or didn't apply, time would still be happening. Because things are, were, and will continue to be happening until they aren't. And we cannot currently re-experience or revisit them outside of our imagination. Though perhaps for our memories, our perception of a section of time could be argued to exist as much as now does, but that's not this video. For example, right now you're experiencing this video and you could re-watch it in the same room under the same circumstances, but you'd always be re-watching this video. It would be happening again and could never be happening for the first time a second time. Even if everyone in existence agreed to turn back the clocks and live a few minutes off forever, that still wouldn't change what had happened because our measurements aren't absolute in the face of existence. It could be argued that this is because we can't perceive time as we're stuck in the boring third dimension, where we have to deal with the limits of physicality and spatial awareness to stop ourselves from bumping into things. But if we could perceive the fourth dimension that is time, then maybe we could avoid that, because we can see that we are, were, and will potentially be walking into that something. This is getting weird already. As the great philosopher Alan Moore once said via a blue doctor made entirely of energy and able to process the fourth dimension, time is simultaneous, an intricately structured jewel that humans insist on viewing one edge at a time, when the whole design is visible in every facet. Let's look at some of the conceptual ideas of the flow of time and how it could be interpreted. While there are several proper names for each of these concepts, to keep things simple I'm going to refer to them as the line, the branch, the circle and the now, which aren't just the bosses in the sequel to the game, Fury. The most common thought, and probably the one you subscribe to even without thinking about it, is the line. Linear time is the idea that time is constantly moving and everything happens sequentially because you can't return to any point. It's the easiest, the most obvious, and realistically it's just how we as humans experience time. And it's the only version that you're likely to ever witness. Though you probably kind of want to see the branch, the idea of tangential time. Or if you're into quantum mechanics, it's the many worlds theory, which could be experienced the same way as the line because while there are timelines splitting off constantly, or at particular points of again many worlds and something to do with universal wave function and superposition, I don't really understand, you'd only be seeing one version of time. People often like this idea because it would be interesting to see how your life would be different based on a different outcome of a big decision, like, what if I'd asked Susie to prom? What if I moved to Kathmandu and learned to arrange flowers?
What if I'd murdered Jeffrey Trouserhanger while I had the chance?
Hey, remember when Matthew McConaughey said, "Time is a flat circle"? Well, while it sounded really dumb and describing a circle as flat is redundant, because circles are inherently flat, the idea of time as a circle is definitely something people follow. The circle is cyclical time, which in many ways is more based on how nature works. Before we had our common recording of time, we used what was just happening around us. Day and night repeat, full moons repeat, the seasons repeat, and the way that we measure time is based around this. There's also the belief in reincarnation, in which when you end, you begin again. There's two things that I find particularly interesting with this one. The first being that if the beginning and the end are the same, then they're not definable. If everything loops, then you wouldn't be able to tell them apart. So the middle of the loop becomes as noteworthy as the beginning or the end because it's all a constant transition. Like on this roll of tape, you might say that this part's the end, but if I just take a piece off, then even though it's in a different place, you might say that this is the end. So if everything's continuous, then there's no need to fear the end, because it would just be the start. The second thing I really like is the idea that the circle doesn't have to be one big circle for everyone. We could all be living in a series of circles that overlap like a cosmic Venn diagram. Then everybody that you've ever lost would have just gone back to live their lives again. That's not a popular idea, and I may even have made it up. But it's a pretty nice one. Depending what your life is like, I guess, but maybe the circles don't have to be the same every time, kind of like the branch. Maybe you get to go through the same life, but experience things in a different way and make the different decisions that you could have in your previous lives. Lastly, we have the now, which is the hardest to express. It wouldn't be a line, it would be a dot, or if it was a solid shape, maybe it would go out in all directions and never end. It's the idea that instead of constantly moving, it's all constantly happening, a simultaneous experience. It's like if you had around a quadrillion photographs that you could see all at once. And from your current perspective, you're seeing them all in order, but really they all still exist. And from an outside perspective, you'd somehow be able to see them all together as one grand picture, which is amazing, but also feels unfathomable. This goes back to Dr. Manhattan, a character who is seeing life from this outside perspective. He knows what's going to happen and has just accepted an outcome that he can agree with. Because he's seeing his death, his childhood, marrying his wife leaving him, and his wife ultimately being happy at the same time. This also gives a unique perspective on existence. If the beginning and the end and everything else are happening at the same time, how can you tell any of them apart? If everything is now, then it's similar to the circle, but with no clear order. Perhaps the world is not made. Perhaps nothing is made. Perhaps it simply is, has been, will always be there. A clock without a craftsman. Let's take a step back from the heavy stuff and just look at where we get the terms and how they've changed. Because while they come from around the same time period, they come from some pretty strange places. So let's dig into the etymology and mythology behind them. The first thing to note is that I'm talking about the Gregorian calendar, which is what most people in English-speaking countries use, and it's worth pointing out something basic that I know a lot of people still get wrong. Side note, I can't speak Latin and this section's going to have a lot of Latin in it, which I'm probably going to pronounce wrong. While a lot of people know that BC stands for before Christ, a lot of people still think that AD stands for after death. But that would mean that we're not accounting for the 33 years that Christians and Catholics believe that Jesus was alive for. AD actually stands for Anno Domini, which is short for Anno Domini Nostri Jesu Christi, which translates to something like in the year of our Lord Jesus Christ. Can't just be me who thinks it's weird that the term for before is in English and the term for after is in Latin. But this means that AD doesn't refer to when Jesus dies, it's referring to when Jesus was born. This system also doesn't include a year zero, so 1 BC would be followed by AD 1. If you want a less religious way of expressing these epochs, you can use before Common Era and Common Era. Next, let's look at the months. January is aptly named for Janus, the Roman god of beginnings, endings, time and transitions, which includes most transitional parts of a building like doorways, gates and passages, and duality. I really like this, adds to the idea of the end being the beginning and just a transition. Saxons called it Wolf Month. I assume because it was cold and they didn't go out much because of the wolves. But we also call the full moon in January Wolf Moon, so maybe it's werewolves. February is named for Die Februaris, a Roman purification festival held on a full moon. 1 or more goats and a dog were sacrificed by brothers of the wolf in the name of King of the Gods, Jupiter. They would then smear the blood onto their head for a bit, wash it off with a milky piece of wool, and have a nice laugh together. Ha 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 ha! Blood! Followed by a feast and finally cutting off a strip of that sacrificial meat to turn into a whip, then nuding up, running anti-clockwise round a hill and meat whipping all the ladies you pass. You know, February! March was the first month of the Roman calendar before January and February were added to fill in the monthless winter. The Romans called it Martius, named for Mars, the Roman god of war and protector of agriculture, amongst other things. His season was considered to go from March until October, because during the winter months there'd be less crops and less war, because it was a bit nippy, and maybe everyone wanted to stay inside with a cup of cocoa instead of stabbing people to death. Side note, this month also had the lunar festival, and Mars' sons were raised by a wolf. April is Aprilis. People are less certain of the origin, but the Latin word apparir means opening, which makes sense for the beginning of spring. The Romans attributed April to Venus, so it's also believable that the name could come from her Greek equivalent, Aphrodite, and have once been called Aphrilis. May and June are likely named for goddesses Maia and Juno, though it's also alluded to in a poem about the Roman calendar that the names come from Maiores, which means elders, and Juniors, which means younger ones, though the words Maiores and Juniors likely come from Maia and Juno, considering Maia is a goddess of growth and Juno, amongst other things, was linked with fertility and vital energy, which is associated with youth. July and August were previously called Quintilis and Sextilis, which mean 5th and 6th, which are boring names that stopped making sense when January and February were added, making 5th and 6th into 7th and 8th. So the Roman Senate renamed Quintilis after Julius Caesar, who'd had an involvement in adding days to the calendar, and later renamed Sextilis after Julius's grandnephew / adopted son Octavian, also known as Augustus Caesar. And just when you thought it made sense to rename those 2 months, we have September, October, November and December, all named for their places in the 10-month Romulan calendar before being moved over 2 months in the Julian calendar and still there in the Gregorian calendar. Septem means 7, Octo means 8, Novem means 9 and Decem means 10. So all of their names literally refer to them as being earlier in the calendar than they have been used in a long time. What's more confusing is those months still occur around the same time of year as they do now. It's just the number placement that's changed. Because most calendars are based around lunar cycles and used full moons as the middle of a month, and anything that went out of sync would be fixed by the loose winter period. So the Romans just reshaped other calendars and filled in the strange dateless winter period with their own system and changed up the names, but it's still given us most of what we use now. Even the word calendar comes from the Latin calend, which refers to the first day of a month. The Gregorian calendar is much the same but has adjustments to make dates more consistent with equinoxes, as the Julian year was slightly too long by 0.0075 of a day, which is like 10 minutes 8 seconds. When shifting from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar in 1582, they also skipped 10 days to make up for the small amount of difference each year. This all goes back to the first part of the video where there's a natural version of time moving, or cycling, or just happening, and a human measurement that we use to track it. We've had many different systems to try and track it using the moon and the seasons, but our concepts and perception aren't concrete. We get things wrong and have to move things around, but nature's still going to happen, even if we nude up and meat whip the ladies on the wrong day of the year. The last thing I want to talk about is how we experience time as an individual. We have systems in place to measure time for all of us as a group, but we can't apply that to how it feels as an individual and how it relates to us as an individual. We've all had times where we've said a day felt slow or a month went by fast, but surely it can't. Time is time, and both nature and science aren't going to change because you're bored or busy. Unless you consider that reality is only truly observed through your experience of it. So for you, maybe time really does feel as though it's moving at a different speed. Maybe everyone is witnessing time at different speeds, and we just have a common ground that we consider normal. So if you think your day has gone by fast and your friend thinks it was slow, even though you ultimately existed for the same amount of time, it doesn't change either of your experiences of time. Even the order of time can be experienced differently. As an example, let's look back at those 2 extra months added into the calendar. Would you consider the other months to have moved forwards or backwards? Because it can be seen both ways. It could be argued that March has moved forward in time as the other 2 months were added in behind it, moving it from 1 to 3. Or it could be considered to have moved backwards in time. It's now later in the year, further from the beginning of the year, and further from the beginning of time. Essentially, without using the words earlier and later, forwards and backwards aren't relative to time. They only work based on your frame of reference because a month is a concept, not a physical object, so those terms can't apply. It's called fictive motion. You're applying a metaphorical movement to a thing that can't actually move. While this is seemingly just a linguistics problem, it also does something weird to our perception of time. Because everyone, without consciously knowing, considers themselves to either be moving through time or time to be moving around them. Do you get to your birthday, or does your birthday get to you? Which is the moving part? If you think that you move to your birthday, you see an ego moving perception. And if you see time as moving and you're waiting for your birthday to get to you, you're seeing in a time moving perception. Personally, I see in a time moving perception. I guess I just consider time to be moving with or without my participation, and it's completely out of my control. What's strange is I used a little test for this on my family, and while my parents both see an ego moving perception, me and my sister both see through a time moving perception. Meaning we weren't taught this perception through our parents, so where did we get it from? Here's the test if you want to try it out. Say you've arranged to meet a friend tomorrow at 12. Then the next morning they message you to say they want to move the meeting time forward an hour. What time are you now supposed to be meeting? Some of you will consider the new meeting time to be 11 o'clock like I do, and others will consider it to be 1 o'clock. Neither answer is right or wrong because forwards and backwards just don't mean anything in terms of time. You should use earlier or later. This is a common test to see which perception you have. If you said 11 o'clock, you have a time-moving perception, and if you said 1 o'clock, you have an ego-moving perception. This also demonstrates why you should say the exact time your moving plans to avoid confusion. While the perception of time can be different for two different people, can time itself be different for two different people?
Yeah, otherwise I wouldn't have bothered asking the question.
Gravitational time dilation occurs with changes in gravity. Put simply, time moves differently on the surface of Earth than it does the further you get away from Earth, and even more so when you're out of orbit. The general rule is the higher the gravity, the slower time is. So as you move further away from Earth, or whichever planet you find yourself on, the faster time will be moving. So if you were floating in space in your little spacesuit, time would be moving faster than it is here on Earth. This wouldn't be by life-altering amounts, you wouldn't exactly crumble into dust and bones, but it is enough to slip clocks out of sync. Similarly, the faster you move, the slower time is. As predicted by Einstein's theory of general relativity and proven on several occasions, velocity alters how time works. Einstein's twin paradox,
Which isn't really a paradox, I'm not sure why it's called that.
theorised the difference in twins when one went into outer space and the other stayed on Earth. And while the space twin would be in lower gravity, they would have moved at much higher speeds to get there, meaning they would come back younger than the Earthbound twin. This doesn't even need to be done on such a grand scale. The Hathaway-Keating experiment tested this using atomic clocks,
Which are clocks that count using the natural frequency of transitions in atoms, so they're both incredibly consistent and accurate.
They took 4 clocks on a flight around the world and then compared them with ones that had stayed in the same spot on Earth. They found that the clocks were out of sync. The times on the ones that had been on the flight were different from the ones that had stayed in one spot. Not by a lot, only by nanoseconds, but enough to prove the point, and it was consistent across the clocks. Then they did the same thing again, but going in the opposite direction around the Earth, and again it had changed. Both planes flew at roughly the same altitude, meaning the gravitational dilation was roughly the same. But flying with and against the Earth's rotation meant that the difference in velocity affected the reading of the flights in comparison with each other. The eastward flight following rotation had a higher velocity, meaning time was slower. The westward flight went against the Earth's rotation and had a lower velocity, and time moved faster. These kinds of tests were used to prove Einstein's theory right on a smaller scale, and there's something that we use all the time without most people knowing. The time on your phone right now was set by GPS signals from a satellite that's in orbit, with lower gravity and higher velocity than you're experiencing here on Earth. So its clock had to be adjusted for that change, otherwise it would be getting more and more out of sync with clocks down here. So, now you know why time is so confusing. Why many historical things might not have happened when you thought they happened, why you'd have to buy a new watch if you were moving to a space colony, and if you've read any books from before 700 BC, why nothing ever happens in January. Further research for this episode includes the movie Primer, the TED-Ed video Einstein's Twin Paradox Explained by Amber Stuver, the book Seconds by Bryan Lee O'Malley, and of course the Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons classic, Watchmen. I'll leave you with one last quote from The Watchmen, a dialogue between Dr. Manhattan and Silk Spectre as they argue about his perception of time. Why does my perception of time distress you? Why ask? You already know my answer, it's stupid. When I left you, when Nova Express attacked you, you were surprised. Why if you knew it would happen? Everything is preordained, even my responses. And you just go through the motions, acting them out. Is that what you are? The most powerful thing in the universe, and you're just a puppet following a script. We're all puppets, Laurie. I'm just a puppet who can see the strings.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this video, please like this video, and if you want to see more, you should subscribe. If you have a question I should answer, let me know in the comments, and if there's someone you know who you think would like this video, then why not send them a link. Bye.